People remember Live Aid as confidence. They remember a band walking on stage like they own the world. They remember perfection. But Brian May remembers something else entirely: fear. Not the kind you feel before a small show. The kind that tightens your chest when you know the whole world is watching and judging. The kind that tells you one mistake will live forever. Years later, Brian would admit something few fans ever expected to hear. Queen didn't walk onto the Live Aid stage feeling powerful. They walked on terrified. Terrified of being irrelevant. Terrified of being exposed. Terrified of confirming what critics had been saying for years, that Queen was a band from the past. Live Aid wasn't just another gig. It was a global spotlight, broadcast to hundreds of millions. 20 minutes, no second chances. No hiding behind production tricks or long sets. And the cruel irony? The audience expected magic. But behind the scenes, Brian questioned everything: the timing, the risk, whether they even belonged on that stage anymore. The legend we see today was built on a moment of doubt no one talks about. Because before Queen became the highlight of Live Aid, they were one bad decision away from humiliation. And that fear began long before the first note was played. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Freddie Mercury and Queen and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share.
All we hear is Radio Gaga, Radio Goo Goo.
By the mid-1980s, Queen was no longer the critics' favorite. New bands were everywhere. Younger, sharper, louder. The industry had shifted, and many voices quietly, and sometimes loudly, suggested Queen's moment had passed. Brian felt it. He read the reviews. He heard the jokes. He sensed the skepticism in the air whenever Queen was mentioned alongside newer acts. To some, they were legends. To others, they were relics. And Live Aid made that tension unavoidable. This wasn't a Queen concert. It wasn't a friendly crowd. It was a lineup stacked with artists who defined the present moment. Queen was there, but they weren't supposed to dominate. Brian knew the narrative waiting for them. If they failed, it wouldn't be a small failure. It would be definitive proof that Queen no longer belonged at the center of rock culture. That pressure weighed heavily on him. Because Brian didn't just want to play well. He wanted to protect the band's legacy and his own sense of identity. Queen wasn't just music, it was his life's work. And Live Aid threatened to either revive it or quietly bury it. As the clock ticked closer to their slot, Brian understood something painfully clear. This wasn't about impressing fans. It was about survival. And they only had 20 minutes to prove they were still alive. 20 minutes. That was all Queen had. No extended intros, no deep cuts, no room to warm up. Every second had to land or the moment would be gone. For Queen, that limitation was terrifying. Brian felt the weight of it more than most. A single missed cue, a flat note, a moment of hesitation, all of it would be amplified by the scale of Live Aid. There was no editing, no erasing mistakes. This was history happening live. And the audience wasn't just in the stadium, it was everywhere. Brian kept running scenarios in his head. What if the crowd didn't respond? What if they sounded dated next to newer acts? What if the energy never connected? Those fears weren't dramatic, they were practical. Because Brian understood something brutal about Live Aid, it didn't care about your past. It rewarded only what worked in that exact moment. And if Queen misjudged the tone even slightly, they would be remembered not as legends, but as a band that tried and failed. As the stage crew moved and the countdown grew shorter, Brian realized this wasn't just a performance. It was an audition for relevance. And he wasn't sure they would pass. While Brian wrestled with doubt, something else was happening inside the band. Freddie Mercury had gone quiet. Not distracted, not nervous, focused. Freddie wasn't joking, he wasn't improvising, he wasn't debating options. From the very beginning, he made it clear there would be no compromises. The set list was locked, the pacing was aggressive, the transitions were tight. Freddie wanted control, total control, and he took it without asking. Brian noticed immediately. Freddie wasn't behaving like a frontman that day, he was behaving like a commander. Every decision was deliberate, every gesture rehearsed, every second accounted for. And strangely, that unsettled Brian, because it meant letting go. Brian had always been deeply involved in shaping Queen's sound and structure. But at Live Aid, Freddie wasn't leaving space for discussion. He knew exactly what needed to happen, and he wasn't open to hesitation. Brian felt something uncomfortable rise in him. What if Freddie was wrong? What if this was too aggressive? What if the confidence was misplaced? But there was no time to argue. As they prepared to walk on stage, Brian realized something that scared him even more than the audience. Freddie wasn't afraid. And if this failed, it wouldn't just expose Queen to the world. It would expose Brian's doubt in the one person who might actually know how to save them. As they waited to go on, Brian felt something he rarely admitted out loud. Doubt. Not doubt in the band's ability to play, not doubt in the songs, but doubt in whether this moment could be controlled once it started. Live Aid wasn't forgiving. It didn't reward caution. It punished hesitation. Brian questioned the intensity of Freddie's approach. The pace felt relentless, the confidence almost confrontational. Brian worried it might come across as arrogance, that the crowd would resist being commanded instead of invited. And there was something else, deeper and more uncomfortable. Brian realized how much he had underestimated Freddie. Not musically, but psychologically. Freddie wasn't reacting to Live Aid. He was anticipating it. He understood the audience's energy before they even made a sound. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply and when to release it. That realization shook Brian, because it meant trusting someone completely at a moment when his own instincts were screaming caution. Letting go of control is harder than making decisions, especially when the stakes are this high. As they stepped toward the stage entrance, Brian felt the weight of his doubts settle in his chest. If Freddie was wrong, the fallout would be historic, and Brian would carry that responsibility forever. But the music had already begun. There was no turning back now. The first note cut through the air, and everything Brian feared vanished. The crowd responded instantly, not politely, not cautiously, instinctively. Thousands of voices surged forward, clapping, shouting, leaning into the sound as if they had been waiting for this exact release. Brian felt it in his hands before his mind could catch up. This wasn't resistance. It was surrender. The audience didn't push back against Freddie's control, they welcomed it. They followed every cue, every pause, every call and response as if it had been rehearsed just for them. Brian looked across the stage. Freddie wasn't guessing. He was conducting. That realization hit Brian like a physical force. The fear that had tightened his chest moments earlier gave way to something else, shock, and then relief. They weren't just surviving, they were dominating. Brian played with new freedom, no longer calculating consequences. He felt the band locked together in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The sound was bigger, sharper, alive. And suddenly, Brian understood why Freddie had taken control so completely. Because hesitation would have killed the moment. Confidence saved it. As the crowd roared back louder with every song, Brian felt a shift inside himself, a quiet admission he would carry long after the applause faded. He had been wrong. By the time the final notes rang out, Brian wasn't thinking about critics or relevance anymore. He was thinking about trust. Freddie had read the room perfectly, not once, every time. Each transition landed. Each pause pulled the crowd closer. The band wasn't just playing well, they were connected to something larger than performance. And Brian knew he hadn't seen it coming. Standing there, guitar still warm in his hands, Brian felt a strange mix of emotions collide. Pride, relief, gratitude, and something harder to name, humility. He realized how close he had come to misjudging the moment and the person leading it. Freddie hadn't been reckless. He had been precise. Every decision had been made with absolute clarity. Brian felt exposed. Not publicly, but internally. Because the fear he carried into Live Aid hadn't been about the crowd. It had been about letting go of control. About trusting that someone else might understand the moment better than he did. And Freddie did. As the applause thundered, Brian felt something settle inside him. Live Aid hadn't just saved Queen's legacy. It had reminded him why Freddie was irreplaceable. Not because of ego, but because of instinct. And Brian would spend years trying to find the right words for that realization without ever fully saying it out loud. When the set ended, the noise didn't stop, but Brian did. Backstage, while the celebration spread around them, he felt strangely still. The adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by a quiet awareness that something irreversible had just happened. Live Aid hadn't just gone well, it had changed the course of Queen. Brian didn't jump around. He didn't shout. He didn't replay the highlights out loud. Instead, he stood there, absorbing the weight of it. The fear he'd carried into the performance was gone, but what replaced it wasn't joy. It was clarity. For the first time in a long while, Brian understood how close Queen had been to losing its place in the world, and how narrowly they'd escaped it. The success felt fragile, almost undeserved, like something that could have slipped away if even one decision had gone differently. Freddie's control, the crowd's response, the perfect alignment of timing and confidence, it all felt almost unreal. And that's why Brian didn't celebrate immediately, because he realized something uncomfortable. If Freddie hadn't taken control so completely, the night might have ended very differently. Live Aid wasn't just a triumph, it was a reminder of how much Queen depended on a single instinct and how close Brian had come to doubting it. Over the years, Brian has spoken about Live Aid countless times. He's praised the performance, he's acknowledged its impact, he's called it a turning point, but there's always been a careful distance in the way he tells the story, because fully explaining Live Aid would require admitting something deeply personal. That he was afraid, that he wasn't sure. That, in that moment, he needed Freddie more than he wanted to admit. For someone as thoughtful and disciplined as Brian, fear isn't something he wears comfortably, neither is vulnerability. It's easier to focus on the technical brilliance, the cultural impact, the legacy. Harder to say, I doubted us, I doubted him, and I was wrong. Live Aid exposed something Brian didn't like seeing in himself, not weakness, but dependence. The realization that Queen's survival wasn't evenly distributed, that Freddie carried something no one else could replicate. Talking about that openly would mean challenging the idea of balance Brian had always believed in. So he keeps it subtle. A pause here, a careful phrase there, an admission that never fully lands. And in that restraint, the emotional truth of Live Aid remains half told. Today, Live Aid is remembered as a flawless moment. A band at the peak of its power, a frontman commanding the world, a legacy sealed in 20 minutes. But behind that legend lives a quieter story. A story about fear disguised as preparation, about doubt hidden behind professionalism, about a guitarist who walked onto the biggest stage of his life, unsure if he still belonged there, and a singer who understood exactly what the moment demanded and refused to let it slip. That's the part Brian May rarely spells out. Not because he wants to protect the myth, but because the truth is more complicated than triumph. Live Aid wasn't just about winning back the crowd. It was about surrendering control, about trusting instinct over caution, confidence over fear, leadership over hesitation. Brian didn't just witness greatness that day. He learned something from it. And that lesson stayed with him long after the applause faded, long after the legend was set in stone. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones we tell loudly, they're the ones we carry quietly. Live Aid is remembered as confidence, as if Queen walked onto that stage knowing exactly what would happen, as if everything was guaranteed, as if fear had no place in that story. But the truth is far more human. For Brian May, Live Aid wasn't just a triumph, it was an exposure. A moment where doubt, pressure, and responsibility collided in front of the entire world. Where he had to confront something uncomfortable, that control doesn't always save you. Sometimes, surrender does. That day, Brian learned that greatness doesn't come from certainty. It comes from trusting the right instinct at the right moment, even when it scares you, especially when it scares you. And that instinct belonged to Freddie Mercury. Freddie didn't just perform at Live Aid, he carried the weight of the moment for all of them. He read the crowd, the tension, the risk, and made decisions without hesitation. Decisions that changed Queen's history in 20 minutes. That's the emotional story Brian rarely tells. Not because it diminishes him, but because it reminds him how close everything came to going wrong. Live Aid wasn't magic. It was fear met with courage. And sometimes, the moments that define us forever are the ones we were most afraid to face. Do you think Queen saved Live Aid, or did Live Aid save Queen? Tell me what you felt watching that performance. I read every comment. If this story made you see Live Aid differently, leave a like, it really helps the channel. And subscribe for more untold Queen stories, not about myths, but about the human moments behind them. Because the greatest performances aren't born from confidence alone. They're born from fear and the courage to walk on stage anyway. By the mid-1980s,